All right. So I'm Jacob Muller. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Forestry, and I really focus on hardwood silviculture and disturbances, storm damage, degraded woodlands, and really thinking about the future of our forests, how we manage, how we might try to make our forests more resilient down decades down the road. So we know that, as I mentioned, our forests are always responding to disturbances, right? And when there's disturbance, oftentimes we're going to have damage to our woodland. Sometimes that damage can be extreme enough to kill the tree. But we define disturbances as events that cause change in the structure of the forest, the species composition, and all of these things beyond just the natural growth and death of an individual tree. So anything that affects a tree from the day that it grows from a seed into a seedling into a mature tree, something that affects that process. And damage to our timber is something that's caused by a disturbance, and that typically decreases or even eliminates its productivity, right? When we say eliminates its productivity, it's kind of a nice way of saying that the tree has died, either main stem breakage or has been uprooted and fallen over. And we've seen these things happen in our woodlands, and it seems like we've seen or experienced these things a lot more recently. But disturbances have been interacting with forests for as long as there's been forests, but the rate, the intensity of those disturbances can change over time, and I think we're beginning to see some of those effects. But disturbances and our forests really interact in two primary ways, through those biotic factors and abiotic factors. And we're acutely aware of both of these factors. Right? We have Dr. Crocker, who she describes both of these, but with a particular focus on these biotic factors, right? Insects, diseases, these things that attack our woodlands or disrupt how they function in the ecosystem. Today, I'm going to be mostly talking about these abiotic factors, right? These things that damage our woodlands, they limit its productivity, can disrupt its natural function. And these are things that we've experienced just in the last 10 months or so that have been very, very visible to all of us here in Kentucky. So again, those biotic disturbances is damage done by another organism. And I'm not going to spend much time on that. But our biotic disturbances, so this is done by something non-living, right? Billy just mentioned these droughty conditions that are happening right now. We're experiencing more droughts in what we call these flashy droughts, or a flash drought that can come on really quickly, dry things out really quickly. And one of the effects of that is wildfire. Right? So when droughts happen, there's often these other perturbations that occur in response. On the other end of the spectrum, when we're getting too much rain, too much water, and these very acute episodic precipitation events, we can experience flooding, especially when our forests and the forest soils are completely saturated. There's nowhere for that water to go, and it can abruptly and quickly run off into our drainage systems, into watersheds. And this, on the other end of the spectrum, is obviously a flash flood. And so these things can have really dramatic impacts in our forests. And I've also mentioned a few other things: freezes, extreme changes in temperature, and obviously tornadoes. But I want to emphasize that our forests are dynamic systems, right? So they're always changing. They always have changed, and they have a certain capacity to adapt to those changing conditions, right? Forests have adapted with disturbances. So we have trees on the landscape that are adapted to a certain level of fire so that they can live and survive and accommodate a certain level of fire and still function in the forest, in the woodland. When these disturbances change, and they change quickly, oftentimes becoming more extreme or more frequent, that can push trees to their limits and basically disable the function of the woodland, those abilities to adapt that trees have developed with might be overcome by rapid change. And that's something that we're keeping our eye on, we're monitoring, we're learning, we're studying, and trying to help foresters, forest managers prepare for rapid and dramatic changes so that forests can remain resilient. Okay. So some things that affect the form, the function, really how this forest operates, right? Our management choices, and these are things that we talk about on this show here in the Department of Forestry all the time. Things, the way that we manage, and hopefully we're making good management choices. We're not always, but that's the goal. The change in the land or land use change has dramatic effects, right? That's kind of obvious. And then these last two are really kind of the focus of this. So the disturbances and future projected climates and how those two things interact. And they're not easy to quantify, right? We're still learning. But we can measure these direct responses following disturbances and monitor that to see how the forest responds. And those are things that we are doing. So I don't think I could talk about disasters without mentioning the Eastern Kentucky flooding that occurred in late July and early August of this year. And it was a historic amount of water, of rain that fell in Eastern Kentucky. And you can really see it in that gray area, greater than 10 inches of rain. So these are historic rains. Hydrologists call these 1 in 1,000-year events. And these things are happening and they're basically exceeding the capacity of our watersheds to contain the amount and intensity of water. Right? So these can have really dramatic effects, right? We don't often associate moderate to low levels of flooding with forest disturbance, but they can, and they can have pretty dramatic impacts in the forest and how they function when you have water that's coming through and remaining in these areas that are, for the most part or most of the year, dry. That can affect how a tree grows. And then you have the more dramatic effects of complete landslides or washing out forests, destabilizing their roots and uprooting the trees. Right. So flooding can affect the tree growth and the tree's survival, really, its ability to persist on the landscape. The flood damage really depends. So how much a tree or what level of injury that tree sustains really does depend on when and how that flooding happens. So time of the year is really important. If flooding were to occur during the dormant season, oftentimes trees are able to withstand a lot of that damage unless it's a complete erosion event or a rapid erosion event, as opposed to the growing season when flooding can have a much more impactful to the function of a particular tree. Trees might need some special care following flooding and we have to ask ourselves, what are we managing, right? So are we managing individual trees, or are we managing an entire woodland, right? And those things are going to impact the decisions that we make, right? If we're just a landowner that has a few trees, you can likely manage those much more intensively than you can a large 40 or 50 acre woodland or larger that you're managing. So those are important considerations to make. Okay. Erosion and changes in the soil characteristics are probably one of the most impactful effects of flooding, right? So when we have a lot of water that is eroding hillsides, that can destabilize trees, cause a lot of uprooting, and limit the amount of nutrients that a tree can take in to grow and survive. So there's a few different types of flood damage that we see in trees or associated with trees. So again, changes to the soil, physical damage, and that one is perhaps more obvious when trees either fall over or wiped down the river or washed down the river, excuse me, or something that's happening that is killing or severely damaging that tree. A few other things that we don't often think about, but could be an important thing to think about are effects after the flooding, right? So insect and disease damage can happen in flooded areas where these trees and these forests or woodlands become weakened, right? So the flooding might stress trees and they don't necessarily, they're not operating at 100%, right? So they might be allocating their resources to other areas of the tree to survive. And what we see oftentimes in these damaged woodlands might be an earlier fall for those trees. We might see leaves coming off sooner than they otherwise would, changing colors and kind of going dormant to kind of preserve their resources, get them through the winter and start back up the next year, hopefully under better circumstances. So a number of different things that we see. Additionally, beyond just the disturbances to a tree, are disturbances to forest roads, right? And culverts, things that divert water away, that might destabilize roads. If we're trying to go in and manage a forest, this could create some major barriers to our access and safety in the woodlands, right? And disrupt other natural functions, house streams, other aquatic species, right? On the other end, last winter, we had two major tornadoes, right? These had really dramatic effects in their own right. You can see in this photo, all these, it just kind of looks like a bunch of matchsticks, right? You can see little root balls uprooted from these very dramatic and intense winds associated with this tornado, right? These are disasters that happen in Kentucky and that woodland owners experience, right? And it can happen on a larger scale than we've often imagined before, affecting thousands of acres through a single event. The event that happened in December impacted over 7,000 or 8,000 acres of woodlands, and so by no means a small impact. Ice storms are another major impact that we experience here in Kentucky that damage our woodlands and cause disruption to the function of our forests. And so collectively, there are a number of different disasters, so disturbances that can happen to our woodlands. And some of the time it might feel like it's just outside of our control. And oftentimes it is, right? We can do so much management in the forest to improve forest health. We can try to make our forests more resilient to wildfire. Maybe that means thinning or clearing out some of the woody debris on the ground and other areas that could carry a fire. Those things are tangible things, but some of these major disturbances can leave us feeling rather helpless as a woodland owner. And it's important to know that there are resources out there for woodland owners. Right? We have a series of publications describing how to manage or how to select trees to manage, what trees might be worth saving in the landscape, what trees should be removed, and the process involved with that. So regardless of the disturbance, a few things to consider, right? Safety is always number one, right? Whether it's flooding, ice storms, tornadoes, you always need to be aware anytime you step into a disturbed area, right? Things to consider whether to cut or leave a tree, what opportunities there are for you, tax deductions through the IRS and NRCS programs that might help you start to manage your woodland or respond to those disturbances, and managing for those wildfire risks or insects and disease risks following any flooding disturbance, right? So I'm just going to quickly breeze through this. These are important things that we need to think about, right? Always wear personal protective equipment. Never go into the woods when it's really windy, especially if there are branches, other trees that are caught hanging up high in the canopy. Those can be extremely dangerous. It's always a good idea to flag those dangerous trees or those dangerous conditions and get those trees out of the woods and especially off the roads and the trails. Okay. Don't cut bent or pinned trees. This can create a lot of tension when they're bent. And when you release that tension, it can create a response that could trigger a really basically a slingshot that could sling a branch or a tree into you or someone else, right? Always looking overhead and never fell lodged trees similar to the pen trees, right? So all sorts of disturbances, and we've got guides to help us. I think I'm running out of time here, but it depends on which trees, how we decide to manage those. If there's just a certain level of damage, or if they're completely, or maybe not completely, but they're reached a point where they're not going to necessarily recover and be healthy parts of the forest ecosystem. So trees experience all of these things: main stem break, major branch breakage, bending trees, greater than 50% crown loss or less than 50% crown loss, and obviously downed trees, right? Times that it's important to probably remove those trees are when we have main stem breakage or even major branch breakage that might introduce pathogens or disease into that tree. It's not going to be able to recover. And depending on your management objectives, if you're okay with having some trees remain in your forest, perhaps even for wildlife, those are all things that you'll want to think about and work with a forester to help you decide how to manage that, right? So again, severe crown loss versus low to moderate crown loss, where when we have low to moderate crown loss, it might not necessarily be a scenario where we need to remove that tree. It might be able to recover and become a functioning part of that forest. All right, so I'm just going to end on with a couple of options that you can do when disaster strikes, right? And number one is assess the damage, right? So you can look at resources that help you recoup some of that money through disaster relief and timber revenue loss. And recoup some of that, right? Unfortunately, so many folks who own woodlands may never recoup the full value of what's lost, depending on what sort of insurance covers that damage or that timber loss. But I always recommend to first thing, get in touch with a forester and be patient, right? When these major events happen, foresters are likely going to be very busy, right? There's all sorts of landowners with unique situations that are reaching out to foresters, especially state KDF foresters. And while they're trying to get out and help everyone, sometimes it does take time. We also have a great group of professionals in this state that are the consulting foresters that you can reach out to perhaps get a forester out more quickly to your land, but that also depends on kind of the level of disturbance. And I can't reiterate this enough, that there is help with damage to your woodland through NRCS, and foresters can really help connect you with those resources. We've also got some resources at kytimberDamage.ca.uky.edu, and feel free to reach out, and hopefully we can help connect you with resources that you need to respond to these disturbances.